So in this video we're going to talk about the questions people ask us usually immediately after we've shared a diagnosis with them. And very quickly we often get asked, well, what does the future hold? Will they be able to go to a normal school? Will they be able to get a job? Will they be able to live on independently? And that's often asked in the children we see who we diagnosed as young as 1 or 2. So these are really natural questions to worry about as soon as a child's diagnosed, but also difficult to answer as well. But we'll do our best to explain the things that we do know and that we don't know. What do you say to families, Kerry, from your point of view at the North East Autism Society when they're asking those sort of things?
Yeah, so I think for us what we try and talk about is that every child and every family is unique as a starting point, really. And I think as well it's important not to try and compare yourself to other people, because that can cause problems in itself. So I think, at those very early stages we'd be just talking about actually, spend some time getting to know your child. I know families spend a lot of time with their children, but actually now you have this diagnosis, what does that mean specifically for your child, and understanding maybe their communication needs or their sensory needs, and kind of, I think it can be very challenging getting a diagnosis for families. It really can, and there's a whole process of emotions that people go through when they get that diagnosis, and people need to feel like that. They need time and space to have those feelings that they're natural. What I try and do, or what the work that we try and do, is to help them move through some of those more negative emotions to more of a problem-solving approach, so an action plan. So, okay, we've experienced these emotions, but what next? What support do we need? Do we need speech and language therapy? Do we need an occupational therapist? What do we need so our child can have the best possible experience in everything that they do?
Good. Yeah. Marie, what are the things we tend to say to families when they're asking about the future?
I think, obviously a crystal ball would be probably one of the best tools we could have as therapists and professionals, because I think as parents ourselves, we do want to know what our children are going to do in the future, but for all of us, whether our child have got extra needs or not, we don't know what's going to happen, and the future is always unpredictable. I think, Kerry, your point about taking it, I guess, one step at a time and trying to sort of think about where they are here and now, and then what's the next step, how we're going to get them onto the next step. And there will be big transition points that will have an impact. Obviously, starting school, moving between primary and secondary, all of those points will have a big impact on a child's development. And I think the one thing I've learned from working with hundreds of families over the years and hundreds of children is that actually there isn't one route forward into the future. That for some children, they do make some really nice progress. It can look really very positive, and then it may well plateau for quite a long time, and then they might have another big jump up and gain some new skills or become more capable, excuse me, in some areas. But for other children, that can just be a really, really slow process. And I think if a family have got other children in the siblings, it's easy to compare them to how those children are doing. And for most children without autism going through typical development, it is a nice, quite smooth path of gaining skills every year. For a child with autism, it's often not a smooth path, that there are little steps and then plateaus. And so it is unpredictable, and it is worrying. I think we do need to acknowledge that for families. But to kind of encourage them to seek support, and as things change, to gain more support and do a bit more reading and research yourself. It's not going to stay the same. And just because you've been told something once as well, I think another reason for us wanting to do these videos is that we give parents a lot of information when they first have the diagnosis, but I think often we don't realise how difficult it can be to take in new information.
Definitely.
When you've been through, a big sort of change and an emotion.
And to remember it all when there's so much all at once.
Yeah. And I think with reading as well, Marie, what you touched on there, important to read around, the topic. I think it's important that parents go to credible sources as well, because there's a lot of negative information out there about autism. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of inaccurate knowledge out there.
Yeah.
So I would advise family members to go to reputable places with reputable professionals, and learning from autistic adults as well is really important. You know, people with lived experience is also, you know, a vital point, I would say.
Marie, one of the things I know we've done clinics together for a long time is families that we see where we're assessing young children who haven't yet developed any language skills. Another very common question from families to you is, well, are they going to speak?
Yeah.
What's your...
Yeah, I think it probably is one of the questions we get asked the most, really, and obviously it is really important. Every parent wants their child to talk and to be able to have conversations. And like I said, you know, at the beginning, we can't predict. You know, for most children with autism, they will learn to use verbal language to varying degrees of sort of success, I suppose. For some children, they might learn enough verbal language to be able to get their basic needs met, to ask for a drink or to ask for help. For some children, they have got very good verbal language already. You know, they can use long sentences, and the difficulty might be more around actually being a two-way conversation, so they can talk, but they're not so good at listening and responding to other people. And for some children with autism, they don't learn verbal language. You know, we do have to recognise that there is a small group of children who don't learn to use language in that way. And for those children, we do need to look at giving them an alternative way of communicating. It's really important that they have got a means to get their messages across.
We sometimes see families who are wanting to jump and work on the language, but the stages before that are not in place. And I know you sometimes explain those early building blocks have to be there.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of a bit like, you know, if you were learning a foreign language, that, you know, we could all learn to say a sentence in Polish or French, but if we don't know sort of what the individual words mean, or we can't listen to the response, we can't understand the response, being able to say those words isn't useful to us. So I think we want to hear the children talking, but we need to really think about sort of it being a two-way process and building up those blocks from very early on, and focusing a lot on the understanding and the listening and responding.
I know you're going to talk about that more in your later videos around communication. For me, I would agree, the future for the children that we see is unpredictable. We can give some information to families about where they are at that particular point in time in terms of their level of skill, but you're right about that unpredictable path of progress. So I've done some graphs, which I often just hand draw in clinic to explain to people that the path, as you mentioned, of typical development is there's usually a very steady year-on-year predictable acquisition of skills. As the child gets older, there's fairly set expectations and a pattern across children from a wide range of background about what they will learn and the skills they'll develop each year. For children who, for example, have a learning disability or an intellectual disability, they will year on year make progress, but at a slower rate. But again, it tends to be a steady but slower trajectory, a slower line of learning skills. For children with autism, it's different again. Sometimes the children we see have actually very advanced skills in one area. So sometimes we see children with very advanced number or reading skills, yet their social skills or skills in another area are really not where they should be for their age. And as you say, sometimes children might be progressing very nicely, but will suddenly just seem to stop and plateau in their development and then have another sort of burst of development. And a significant proportion of the young children we see will have seemed to develop very typically in the first year or so in terms of their sitting, their standing, their walking on time, so their physical skills have developed quite well. But when it comes to starting to develop the social and communication skills, they might begin, but then they'll stop. And actually, some of the children we see between the ages of about 1 and around 3 will do what we call regress and actually lose some of those nice early skills that they developed. And we know this happens from the children we see, and families will often bring us videos, and clearly the child has been saying words or interacting or perhaps using nice eye contact or gestures, and have definitely lost those skills and gone backwards, which is incredibly frustrating and difficult for families. Usually that regression will halt and they will begin to pick those skills back up again, but not always. It is unpredictable. In terms of looking at long term, often we see children who as young as 1 or 2 or 3 that we diagnose, and straight away the parents are saying, will they go to a normal school? Will they be able to get a job? Will they be able to get married? Will they be able to live independently? They're all really natural questions, and it is difficult to predict. I think one of the big predictors of the young children we diagnose with autism is whether or not they have a learning disability or intellectual disability associated with autism. We know around about 2/3 of people diagnosed with autism will also have an intellectual disability, and that has a big impact on how much support they will need through school and in adult life. It's not just the autism, it's whether there's an intellectual disability as well. It's not as simple as saying, if you've got intellectual disability, you'll need a lot of support, and if you don't, you won't. It really isn't that simple. As we've discussed, it's a much more complex picture, but often that does have a big predictive factor. And also we know there's a much higher incidence of other developmental difficulties, such as developmental coordination disorder, so your coordination and motor skills, and also ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and they can also impact on a child's development. So once we've diagnosed autism, we do need to be conscious if there's other difficulties alongside. When we see children very young, it's usually too early to make those diagnoses, and it's often not into school years till they become more apparent, but we need to be conscious they can impact on long-term help support as the child gets older as well. Another thing that we need to think about is about explaining to the child about their difficulties. For most of the children we diagnose at a preschool age, they are not at a developmental level to have enough of understanding to really start doing that, but some of them are. And I think it's important to say to families early on to start communicating at a very simple level that a child can understand about any difficulties they may have. Kerry, you obviously have experience with that, working with older children and families as well. How do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree, Helen, with what you're saying, to start that conversation early on, because we find a lot of teenagers that I work with don't understand that they're autistic. They don't understand what that means. And actually, when you start having these discussions, the world kind of makes sense to them. And the other big part of that is they can find their own community. So actually, the autistic people I work with, the youngsters, they're quite happy in a room with other autistic people because they've got that kind of shared identity and sense of community. So I think starting early, obviously is parental choice, but I think it's a good thing. And what we do at a very simple level is talk about differences. So we talk about, that everybody in this room is different, and that's absolutely okay. And I think that positive message is really important for young people, children and young people, because as they grow up, we do see many autistic teenagers that have problems with self-esteem and understanding their own identity. So even though, you might have a little person and you're thinking, I'm not even at that stage of even thinking about that yet, I think it's important to keep it in the back of your head, because it can have an impact later on as the child, enters adolescence, for example.
I think the other thing I'm conscious of as well is if that information doesn't come from the parents and the family, often there's so much awareness about autism now, the child is then going to stumble across it from somewhere else, from somebody saying something at school, from reading things, and it might not be very helpful, and it might not be shared in a helpful, supportive way. So it's much better being managed and coming from the family in a way that you would want to share that information with the child, rather than being done in the wrong and helpful way from somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing we say to families is don't wait until your child is having, you know, a real crisis in their life to share that information, because then the child understands being autistic relates to me having all these difficulties, so it kind of is counterproductive in a way. But, you know, a lot of families do choose to tell the child they're autistic when they're having a bad time. So I think that's just something to be mindful as well.
That's a really good point, actually.
I hadn't thought about that, Karen. It is a really good point. And I was just thinking as well about siblings, obviously in the family. It's really important to talk to them as well, isn't it? Because they will perhaps be aware that their brother or sister is different, and how you talk about that and introduce it is important.
Absolutely, and I think, Marie, siblings are very underrepresented. You know, I mean, I have a brother who has learning disabilities myself, so I have personal experience of it. And I think, you know, we did a group many years ago, and we had a group of siblings of autistic children, and it was so empowering. These young people were, you know, able to say, well, you know, my brother, he wakes up in the middle of the night, what does your brother or sister do? And I think, I think we need to do, you know, as a society, more work on supporting siblings, actually.
Because it's the whole family, isn't it?
Of course,
obviously,
Yeah, and I've seen that watching even really young children with another child who has been hasn't had autism but has had quite severe disabilities, that wasn't mobile. These young toddlers actually, without anybody saying or explaining, were going and fetching toys and bringing them to the child in the nursery room who wasn't mobile, and somehow had understood that they couldn't get them. So I don't think we should underestimate that even quite young children realise and pick up on differences and start to compensate and want to help and support. So I think it's important for us to be open and supportive of that, and not try and sort of dodge the issue because we're perhaps not comfortable, I don't know how to handle it. And I also think if families aren't sure about what to say to their child or to the siblings or how to handle it, contact somebody like the North East Autism Society or professionals who can give you ideas about how to handle it and what to say, because dodging the issue isn't usually the right way to go. It's being, well, I think I need to do this, but what's the best way to go about it, and getting some support.